was the summer of 2014, and for my son's bar mitzvah present, just like many Jewish parents, we wanted him to bond with the Holy Land. Oh, it worked perhaps too well. My husband had stayed back at the hotel, and our friends, my son and I, had just stopped in a pharmacy.
Run to the bomb shelter, sweetie, please hurry. I didn't hear the sirens at first, but the Israelis did. They're used to hearing these things. We ran to the back of the storeroom. It was a 12-foot by 24-foot windowless bomb shelter. My heart's pounding. Boom, boom. I hear it and feel the percussion of the exploding bombs. I'm trying not to get sick. I look at my 13-year-old son and I think I'll never forgive myself if something happens to him.
That's an excerpt from a speech I gave to the Orange County Jewish Bar Association. It was the first, but not the last time we had to run to a bomb shelter. Our adventure and my transformation is also the subject of my book, Blasted from Complacency, A Journey from Terror to Transformation in Israel. There is no chapter in a parenting book on what to do when a war starts and you're on a family vacation. Think touring extraordinary and sacred sites mixed with cowering in bomb shelters. I'm still trying to get over the Jewish guilt of taking my son to war for his bar mitzvah present. The impact of being human targets helped me understand the plight of Israelis living like this, and it also made me want to work on peace. How Israel is often described on the news is not what I'd seen with my own eyes. And I felt Palestinian parents also preferred their children playing safely in their backyards. The missiles exploded just near enough to blow apart my world as I knew it, forever changing me. And you'd never recognize my life today with what it was like then. I believe I found my life's purpose. Hello, I'm Penny ST, and I'm the host of Peace with Penny. Welcome. It's great to begin another episode in Season 2 of Peace with Penny, especially with such a special peacemaker. Avi Meyerstein is the founder and president of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, or AllMEP. Starting in 2003, Avi brought together dozens of NGOs to build an umbrella coalition that would significantly expand resources and scale up Israeli-Palestinian grassroots partnerships. Over many years, their advocacy strategies and efforts led to over $130 million in annual U.S. funding programs for these critical activities. Avi also proposed and launched the initiative to create an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace. With bipartisan leadership in Congress and a broad coalition, that effort most recently led to the passage of the Nita M Lowey Middle East Partnership for Peace Act of 2020, or MEPPA, which provides $250 million for joint economic and people-to-people partnerships over the first 5 years. In 2021 to 22, Avi is a Fulbright Global Scholar and MEPPA Policy Fellow, living in Israel for the year with his wife, Dana, and their 3 daughters. Among other efforts, he's working with AllMEP, its members, and other stakeholders to help prepare the field for the game-changing U.S. investment on the way. Welcome, Avi.
Thank you, Penny. Great to be with you.
It's great to have you. Before we get into the details of your amazing organization, I think it would be helpful to take a look at a short clip that explains much of what AllMEP does. So,
a Palestinian sniper killed my son David.
An Israeli soldier shot and killed my 10 years old daughter, Abir.
When I take the bus, my parents are afraid that there might be a terrorist attack.
Jewish extremists tried to burn down my school.
With decades of division, conflict, and unsuccessful peace efforts, fear and mistrust between Israelis and Palestinians, especially among the youth, has never been greater. This is the reality that AllMEP, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, seeks to change. AllMEP is a coalition of over 125 organizations and tens of thousands of Palestinians and Israelis, Jews and Arabs, building the civic foundations for peace. We foster cooperation within the peace-building field and advocate to governments around the world that they should invest greater resources toward our members' work. One AllMEP member is the Parents' Circle.
To commemorate David's name, I work with Palestinians for peace.
To commemorate Abir's name, I work with Israelis for Peace.
The Parents' Circle is an organization of more than 600 Palestinian and Israeli families who have lost loved ones in the conflict. Together, they work for peace, for a future where no other family will have to experience such loss.
I think standing on a stage all over the world and in Israel and Palestine, together with a Palestinian partner, for me, is the most effective way. Because if we, who have suffered, can stand on the stage and are the least likely people to do this, then surely that's an example to other people.
In fact, especially because we share the same pain, we lost our kids. And we discovered that in their name, our revenge is to make peace.
Hand in Hand is another member of AllMEP. It's a network of bilingual schools and communities in Israel where Jewish and Arab children and their families live and learn together.
Most Jewish kids in Israel don't ever get to meet Arabs, but we get to see each other every day.
It's really good that we can just sit in the same class and learn together and actually have fun together. It's easier to fear and to hate when you don't know each other.
Through Olive Oil Without Borders, business partnerships produce more than just profits.
If it wasn't for Olive Oil Without Borders, I would never meet Palestinians. And meeting them, seeing that we're very similar, gives me hope for the future.
من خلال العمل المشترك الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي إحنا بنربح أنفسنا وبنربح السلام للجميع.
AllMEP has so far unlocked over $130 million in government funding for Palestinian and Israeli peace builders. That has driven real change on the ground and impacted tens of thousands of lives. But we need to reach millions. That's why AllMEP is expanding its efforts and looking to models that have worked elsewhere. Northern Ireland. There too, fear and mistrust had never been greater. After decades of division and conflict, trust between Catholics and Protestants was shattered. To most people, peace was an impossibility. Yet, the impossible was overcome. A peace agreement was signed. It holds to this day. How? By building from the bottom up. The International Fund for Ireland, a little-known strategic fund, invested over $1 billion starting 12 years before a peace deal, in what the UK's chief negotiator said was the great unsung hero of the peace process. It built trust and sustains peace to this very day. It's time to bring this successful model to the Middle East and establish an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace. This isn't just an idea. Thanks to a decade of AllMEP's advocacy, the fund was endorsed by the UK government, and the United States government has now enacted legislation promising $250 million over 5 years toward the fund, representing the largest ever investment in Israeli-Palestinian peace building. While this is a start, it isn't enough. We need your support to bring more countries on board, so the resources available to those working for peace match the scale of the challenge. And then the thousands can become millions.
We can build trust.
We can work together.
We will make peace.
We will make peace.
We will make peace together with your support. Help us make the International Fund for Israeli-Palestinian Peace a reality.
That was a great recap of some of the organizations involved in AllMEP and the work you do, but there's even been more great news than from when this video was made. First, you now have almost 160 Palestinian and Israeli organizations working together. And secondarily, MEPPA, or what's also called the Lowey Fund, passed in Congress, which is providing $250 million in funding. And we'll get into those details later, but Avi, you founded and helped build this inspiring organization. I think it's always interesting to find out a bit about our peacemakers' personal journeys. So, Avi, you're currently living in Israel for a year with your wife and 3 kids, yet you're usually in Washington, D.C. What are you working on in Israel?
Well, Penny, you mentioned the law that passed in the Congress as a result of a 12-year campaign by AllMEP and many partners that we brought to work side by side with us. And that represents $250 million that are going to be flowing over the next 5 to 10 years to really scale up all of this work with the examples that we saw in the video. And it's even a part of AllMEP's bigger campaign to create an international fund, which was mentioned as well. So what I'm doing here is I've come at sort of a moment of opportunity where we really see potentially an inflection point where we're going to move from a world in which the peace builders were working in tiny budgets and limited resources and very little support, relatively speaking, to a world in which they might finally start to see the kind of investment in the grassroots that we've long needed. One of my favorite statistics when we look at the Ireland and the Israeli examples and how those conflicts, which were both considered completely intractable in the 1980s, how they really took two different paths in the decades that followed. And that International Fund for Ireland represents $44 per person per year of all the people that lived in that conflict zone in terms of the investment that was made by the international community in building this grassroots partnership, building the trust that the peace needed. And in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we've spent $1.50, $44, $1.50. So even though on the one hand, it sounds like we're just talking about money, what we're really talking about are changing people's lives every day by building cooperation and partnerships and ultimately trust between the sides of the conflict, almost reaching around the stalemate that the political leaders face by creating that constituency on the ground, the support that they'll need in order to make the tough diplomatic decisions. So I'm here this year doing all kinds of things relating to how we prepare the field for that kind of scale, how we help 160 organizations and even some more that are out there prepare to think on a different level in terms of the reach of their work and the structure of their programs and how they partner together, how we build the scaffolding around it, because there's all kinds of things that need to go along when you're scaling an entire industry like this, for lack of a better word. And of course, how we continue to bring the rest of the world around to the table so that we can build that international fund.
I know that your interest in peace work in Israel has some strong roots in your personal history. Maybe it's the Jewish mom in me, but can you talk a little bit about your parents and your Zionist family that you grew up in?
Yeah, it's, I feel like it's a stereotype in some ways, but I had a very traditional Jewish upbringing, a very pro-Israel upbringing. My dad's a rabbi. My mom's named Israela because she was born in 1948. I went to Jewish summer camp, labor Zionist summer camp, no less, Jewish day schools, the whole kit and caboodle. It was thick, and it's how I was raised. And it gave me a real attachment and a connection to the land and the people, which was my launching off point, to be honest. Now, I went through a lot of evolution when I went to college and actually, in addition to studying things on paper, I started to do things and to talk to people. And there was actually one student, he was a Palestinian, and we were exchanging letters in the student newspaper. He would come to the defense of the Palestinians when the Oslo process was collapsing. I would come to the defense of the Israelis, as I was trained to do. And what was amazing was we took that conversation offline from the newspaper pages to a series of emails and conversations where we sort of debated the conflict and the history, but it was really eye-opening to me to have that engagement. And years later, when I after having become a lawyer and working a bit in US politics and so forth, I was pulled back into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because I was watching the Second Intifada and sitting in Washington, looking at it on TV and feeling so helpless and so hopeless to be far away and to see people dying, killing each other, again, senselessly, after we thought we had almost solved this thing. And I frankly see it as selfish. I wanted to feel like I could do something. And that's when I began connecting with the organizations that were, many of them already doing some very difficult work on the ground and creating AllMEP.
That was in 2003, I believe.
Yeah, in the summer of 2003, I reached out to 3 organizations. I only knew of 3 that were out there doing this kind of peace building, building relationships, building cooperation. Because from looking at the peace process over what 12 years or so, it seemed to me that we kept hitting the same brick wall, which was the wall of trust and mistrust. And no matter how far a brave politician might be willing to go, and they weren't always brave, but even when they put it on paper and signed it, if the publics were not behind them, if they turned around and they didn't feel that the majorities who said they supported the peace process were actually actively engaged and mobilized and supportive, then the whole thing crumbles. And we saw, unfortunately, in the 90s and the 2000s, how a relative minority of people who were opposed, and there will always be minorities like that, were on both sides, were
And
able
very
to,
vocal, unfortunately.
very vocal and very violent, more importantly.
Yes.
They were able to tear it down because everybody else was not engaged and they weren't committed. And when I looked at the opinion polls, you'd see large majorities who supported the peace process, but the same number of people would tell the pollsters, but we don't think it's ever going to happen. And you ask them why, and they'd say, because the other side doesn't feel the same way. The other side doesn't want it. And so to sit from the sidelines and look at this, it's crazy. And what was even crazier is when I started talking to those 3 organizations, and they all said they had the same problems. They said, I reached out as a lawyer. I said, maybe there's something we can do to help here from Washington. And they said, well, nobody knows we exist, even though we're doing crazy work, changing people's lives, transforming their attitudes, taking enemies and turning them into partners. But nobody knows we exist. All you see on the news is violence. Number 2, we're doing incredible work on shoestring budgets. In fact, and here's the crazy thing, they said, and this remains true today, they said we have waiting lists of Israelis and Palestinians who want to become partners and work together, send their kids to school together or to sports programs, to participate in business incubators or economic, environmental projects together, but they had waiting lists because they didn't have enough resources to meet the needs of all of those people. And to me, that was insane, that we had Israelis and Palestinians who wanted to work together, but we're just letting it fade off into the sunset because we didn't have the resources. And so that's when we started and tried to find as many organizations as we could to tackle those problems of visibility and resources. And along the way, we also discovered that the organizations were completely disconnected from each other. And so they were doing this very lonely work, and it was twice as hard as it had to be. And so those are the things that AllMEP set out to do already back then in 2003, 2004.
That's so great. And I know this is considered track 2 diplomacy. Can you talk a little bit about that technical term that you hear from now and again?
Sure. Well, so some people don't even consider this track 2. They think
Oh, really?
track 2. Yeah, I mean, track 1 diplomacy is, of course, the heads of state and the secretaries of state and the negotiators who sit around a table representing their countries or their national movements to try to hash out a peace deal. Track 2 is sometimes talked about as everything else that goes on below that, There's some people who talk about track 2, and what they really are thinking about is the non-governmental negotiator types. Like in the Oslo process, you had some academics, for example, who got together with the involvement and support of the governments, but they were doing it as sort of proxies. But I often think about the rest of the work as track 2, which is every kind of engagement and project and activity that we all take, that all takes place in all of our daily lives, from things that happen in your community to your kids going to school, having after-school activities, women's groups, environmental projects, business projects, agricultural, high-tech, medicine, all aspects of daily life. Instead of doing them separately, Israelis and Palestinians, which is the norm, completely separate, you do them together. And you build partnerships out of that. So you basically embed these projects in people's lives. You're giving people something they need to live life. Most of the time you're improving on the situation they had, because you're often dealing with people who didn't have clean water, who didn't have a place to send their kids for a good education, who didn't have opportunities to grow businesses. So you're providing that, but you're doing it through partnership. So you're really interlocking a better life with partnership and trust that peace is going to need one day.
Well, I know from doing my interviews how interesting and amazing these peacemakers are that I get to interview, and I'm having the time of my life. You work with nearly 160 of these organizations, and you described your experience as getting to work with your heroes. Can you talk about that?
That's really how I feel. I mean, I've worked with these organizations for the last 18 years, and that entire time I was living overseas in Washington. I would come on visits to the region, and they would come on visits to America, but I never had the chance to really, show up for work every day, as it were, and roll up my sleeves and sit side by side with them and spend days on end and be able to come back a few weeks later and really have a deep engagement like this. So I do feel like I get to work with my heroes, and these people, I mean, they defy everything you think you know about the world and the conflict. It's like the parents in the video, Roby, as an example.
Yeah.
And you can't imagine someone who has lost a loved one and who decides, as Bassam said, who decides that their revenge is going to be making peace. It gives me chills every time I sit next to them and hear them talk. And I have to say, the thing that I always knew intellectually, and I'm the kind of guy, I'm sort of a conflict nerd in a sense, I considered it my job from far away in Washington to read as much as I could, to watch and listen to the news, to stay in touch with what was going on the ground. And even with that, and even with coming on frequent visits, there's nothing like being here for an extended period and really feeling and tasting what these people are going through. And I'm not. I mean, it's a lame substitute to be here temporarily and in and out with them, but to just see them on a daily basis, the struggles that they face, to sell this in their own communities, to do this work under suspicion, under skepticism, under hopelessness, under apathy,
risk to their lives often.
Not to mention the very live conflict. I mean, we're only a few months away now from some of the worst violence in nature that this conflict has ever shown us. And so they're really doing this amazing work. Every day they get up and they dust themselves off and they do it all over again. And it's really incredible.
Yeah, you and I are definitely kindred spirits. Well, you perhaps are braver than I, because I think the 2 weeks I spent there running to bomb shelters was plenty, perhaps a bit too much. I think I grew up on too much chicken soup to deal with it, but I really consider it a privilege to be able to get to speak with these people. People like Robbie, I had before Peace with Penny, I had written many articles and so on, and so I had interviewed her previously and written about her, and oh my goodness, how people, can get beyond losing their children, and I mean, I always call them angels on earth because I truly believe they are. So I've interviewed several of your organizations from AllMEP on Peace with Penny, and I have more slated for future episodes. And anyone interested, you can find the recordings on my website at www.pennyst.com under podcasts, or on my Facebook pages for Peace with Penny, or my personal Facebook page. But to mention just a few that we've interviewed, there's been Women Wage Peace, who we interviewed April 20th, and Combatants for Peace. And we did a two-part series with both the Israeli and Palestinian peace activists separately, because both of their stories were just so interesting, and I didn't want to squeeze it into one. And that was in July. And then and they're Israeli and Palestinian ex-fighters who today work on peace. And we've also interviewed Amal, who has Palestinian college students teaching Arabic to Israeli Jewish elementary students. And this is really oftentimes the first time they've seen Palestinian young people as role models for these young Jewish kids. And that was on October 19th. And coming up, December 14th, we're going to be talking with an education project of Israelis and Palestinians from high tech called Tech to Peace. And next year, we've already slated, Anachnu, which is, they actually have a peace plan that they've developed, and in the future, we plan on doing many interviews with AllMEP members. But do you want to name just a few of the 160 that come to mind?
It's always risky. I can get in trouble.
I know. I didn't want to say name your favorite, because that definitely will get you in trouble. But I mean, somebody for one reason or another, something's happening right now or soon to happen.
For sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say before I do that, I'm glad you shared with the viewers a little bit of the teasers for all of the shows you've done and are planning, because this is the work that you're doing to bring this to people's awareness, to bring the stories out, is so important. We even have a program called MIDI Storytellers, where we're helping the people who go through these programs to tell their stories better. But knowing how to tell the story is just half the battle. Then you need a platform to tell it on. And so what you're doing here is really a huge service, in my opinion, to the work that's taking place. Because one of the things we found very early on, frankly, was the peace builders who are doing this incredible work, sometimes under fire and certainly under great strain. They get so much fuel and energy from feeling like they have people behind them. And they felt that way when we brought them to Washington and they spoke to people in Congress and the White House and the State Department. And they feel that way when people tell their stories and listen to what they're going through. So thank you for doing it.
Well, right. It's my definite pleasure. And I'm hoping as a bonus to offer potential spots to those folks who took the time and effort to learn how to tell their stories. Now, I want to, provide a platform where they can. So I'm looking forward to doing that. Yeah.
Well, we're very grateful for it. And I know they are, especially. You asked me about organizations. Some of the most compelling ones we featured in that video. I think it's really incredible to see organizations that work with youth, because that gives you a taste of what the future will look like, how much we how much we nurture and care for the youth and the experiences that they have as when they're young in their formative years is directly related to what the world will look like 20 years from now. And so from the schools of Hand in Hand to the Peace Players program and all of the soccer and basketball and after school programs that take place, Kids for Peace in Jerusalem with interfaith gatherings of young people and their families, with the Jerusalem Youth Chorus, which makes incredible music, original music, together, giving them skills that they'll benefit from their entire lives. The youth programs are just so inspirational, I think, and not in a naive way, in a very tangible way, because what people experience in their formative years will shape them. And we know this from polls that we're doing right now. We're finishing a poll that we've been working on of youth attitudes from the generation that grew up after the peace process failed. And some of it's not pretty, and it's not a surprise, because what else would you expect? So the youth programs are incredible. The Tech to Peace you mentioned, my wife and I had the good fortune of visiting with them a few weeks ago and watching one day of their program, and to see them take Israeli and Palestinian young adults. We're not even talking about kids anymore. We're talking about people in their 20s who take time out of their lives and their schedules to devote quite a few days to this program. And they huddle in groups together, and they're each coming up with ideas for startups. And they're getting support from people like the Google folks who were there as part of the program, and the huge high-tech companies that we all know who are there as part of the program. It's really something. And then you start to play it forward and you think, wow, if these people, if you've got 30 people here in every cohort of this program, and each one of them is trying to make a startup, and a few of those startups succeed, and then those startups hire tens and then hundreds and then thousands of people. And even the ones that don't have startups in the end, but end up working in large companies, and they're all coming to the table to wherever they are with the values that they learn in these programs and the partnerships that they gain, you start to realize how the world actually can change, starting with these seeds and spreading outwards. So
Israel's,
like you said, it's 160. I can go on and on.
Yeah, I know.
Each one is amazing.
I mean, Israel is always been known for such a huge, innovative, innovative society and tech particularly. And so to tap in to both sides and working together is fantastic. But going back to the clip, I don't know. Every time I look at that Palestinian young girl saying that there's going to be peace, and she looks at that camera with such surety and confidence, that just gives me chills. That's what better message, really. But I know as an organization, you feel it's particularly important to look at the big picture. And in AllMEP, how have you answered questions like, where do you want to be in 20 years? How are you going to get there? And what's it going to take?
So some of that is what I'm working on right now. And for that reason, I don't pretend like we have all the answers. We're very much working on it. In particular, we want to make sure that as these new funds from the United States start to come out, and hopefully as we continue to build towards it, an even larger international fund, that someone, and hopefully many people who have a lot of experience in this space, have sat down to think about what the next 10 to 20 years can and should look like. We don't want to just be running off in random directions. We want to be getting the most bang for our buck. But I think fundamentally, we go back to looking at the stage as it exists now. The stage as it exists now is most Israelis and Palestinians have no contact whatsoever with the other side, certainly not positive contact. If you're a Palestinian living in the West Bank, you might encounter Israelis as soldiers or settlers. Neither one of those tend to be positive encounters for the most part. If you're a Palestinian in Gaza, you're having almost no contact with anybody outside Gaza. And if you're Israeli, you might have contact with some Palestinian Israelis within Israel. But to the extent that that happens, it tends to be superficial in the sense that it's a service, transactional kind of experience. Someone who works in a store, someone who works in a company, in the government, things like that. And so the school systems are separate. That's just how it is here.
They don't often speak the same language. I mean, it's bizarre.
100%. They don't often speak the same language.
So how can you communicate? You know, I mean, it begins there. How do you, obviously we know of people, many people do speak English later on, but when they're young, how could you communicate with each other?
On the one hand, that is definitely a challenge. And it's why there are so many different programs working on that problem of language. There are programs that work in schools. There are programs that work outside. There are many different ways to attack that problem. English does become a common language that people tend to use in a lot of these settings. But what's interesting also is when you roll back and you're dealing with even younger people, you can do a lot if you're playing a soccer game. If you're getting together for an activity. I'm seeing this with my own daughter now, actually, who's in 5th grade and is in an Israeli public school where people generally don't speak English. She's getting along much easier in many cases than the high school kids we have, because they're kids, they play, they can do a lot, even without the language. So it's not a total block by any stretch. But wow. We look at the
you're kind of living what's going on in Israel with your kids. You know, you're there for a year. You know, they're American kids, and now they're kind of thrown into the system of different languages and different, even, I guess, are there Palestinians also in their school?
No,
where there are.
Okay. The school systems are separate.
Okay.
And except if you happen to be lucky enough to live near one of the fewer than a dozen in the entire area that are mixed schools, and those schools are members of AllMEP, like Hand in Hand and Neve Shalom, and so on. And so and even those, they have waiting lists. So for the most part, it's a separate schooling and youth that you have. So we look at the stage, to go back to your question, we look at the situation today and we say, those are the things we need to change. We need to create the engagement. We need to create the opportunities. We need to make it meaningful. We need to help people understand each other and build partnerships. And at the end of the day, I wrote a piece in the last couple of weeks that's on the Times of Israel website about during the time when we were remembering the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, who I think we can also say it was the murder of the peace process. And because really you can trace a lot of the dissent in the peace process from that time. And in this article, I mentioned that I had been in Israel a few months before he was killed, and I was at an event where he spoke. And when he came on the stage, the whole stadium erupted in boos and jeering and criticism, harsh. And this was a founding father of the state. It really, as someone who was just visiting at the time from America, it was very shocking, even though that was the nature of the political environment in Israel at the time. And so when I think back to that moment and I think about what kind of crowd would you love to see in a stadium when you've got a peace process going? You want a crowd that does the opposite. You want people that are engaged, that feel supportive, because at the time in the 90s, we had at times 60, 70% and more who said they supported the peace process on both sides. And yet all it took was a relative few number of people to engage in some extreme violence and it all came crashing down. So all of the deep work that we need to do to change that scene so that in the future it will play out differently. And on this, we also look to the Ireland example, because we see how, and I know the video explained a little about the parallels that we draw. This International Fund for Ireland began its work in the 1980s, when that conflict was more violent on a daily basis than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was. And that fund worked for 12 years before the Good Friday Accords. And when the Accords were signed, they put it to a referendum. And we saw that there was 70+% and 90+% support by the public for those peace accords in those referenda, which is something that happens after you invest deeply in building those partnerships and building trust and bringing down the barriers and all of the fear. And then the more interesting thing almost to me is what happened afterwards. Afterwards, you had a peace deal, it was supported by the public, and of course you still had rejectionists, you still had people who would go off and try to rekindle the violence. And when they did, they failed, because the public had been prepared, the publics on both sides were partners, and they would get out in the streets and they would say, we will not be taken back to that dark place. So in the big scheme of things, when we think about where we want to go, that's where I'd like to go. That's where I'd like to see the equivalent kind of investment, the equivalent kind of deep, deep work and roots planted so that people will be committed and unwavering. And I talk to people and a lot of people that are very interested in the different political solutions. You know, what are the options even? Is a two-state solution possible? Is it a confederation? Is it one state? You have many people on both sides who now talk about one state of different kinds. And the interesting thing is if you analyze all of these different options, almost none of them are really possible to achieve actual peace and security and democratic rights and everything. None of them are possible if you don't actually build the trust and cancel out the fear. As long as you haven't attacked those problems, you either will never reach an agreement or you'll never reach a new scenario that people are willing to accept, because you haven't gotten their buy-in. On the other hand, if you include the people and you engage the people and you make them full partners and actors and empower them, then almost any of these options are possible. And it's not for us necessarily to dictate the actual contours of solution X, Y, or Z. By and large, the people in our space are working towards a two-state solution because they understand that giving each side its national rights and giving it its expression of its nationalism and giving it its connection to the land and all of those things are important. But we're not here to dictate the terms of it. What we're doing is giving people a channel and a platform so that they can be part of that solution together. And once you do that, all kinds of things become possible.
Yeah, I know you believe we're really at a turning point right now. Can you talk a bit about that?
To me, the turning point is a combination of things. If you look at look at the setting that we're in. We're in a moment where most people have completely given up on diplomatic solutions. At least they don't see a horizon anywhere in the future where some grand bargain is going to be struck and you're going to solve the conflict the way that we've tried so many times before. You can analyze it for hours why that is politically, but that's how most people see it. You know, the Israeli change government has introduced some new variables to the equation. The possibility of eventual political change among the Palestinians obviously would introduce new variables, but at the very moment we're at right now, that's all sort of up in the air speculation, maybe, don't know, you know, we'll see. And so there's a lot of despair, but also apathy and just a feeling like, you know, it's not even worth engaging on the one hand, that there's no path forward politically. But at the same time, we have this unprecedented historic investment that the United States has committed to with the $250 million in MEPPA, in the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, the Lowey Fund.
Mhm.
And we have very exciting interest from other governments around the world
Mhm.
to leverage that US commitment and take it to the next step. And on top of that, we have strategic philanthropists, private funders and donors who we're talking to now as a field, as AllMEP, because they're saying, we've been involved in this space for many years, or we want to be involved in this space. We've supported these programs, and now we see all these resources coming. What's our role? What can we do to work upstream and alongside and downstream this major new investment? And so then you start to see some other things that have been developing and changing. I mean, walking around Israel today, at least within Israel, there is progress. It's still got a long ways to go, and it won't happen by itself, but the engagement of Palestinians in different sectors of the economy, things of that sort, where people are starting to be more open than they might have been once upon a time. Of course, that says nothing about how we deal with the challenges of the West Bank and the continued occupation and so forth. So there are these openings, and we see this investment coming in. And, you know, one of the things we saw in this youth poll, which although there are some very harsh attitudes in there from both sides about the other, as you'd expect, after they grew up in this cauldron of hate and fear and violence, there's openness, and there's shared values in some ways. They might not call it that because they're not talking to each other, but they both want democracy. They both want economic prosperity. And many of them, many more than you might expect, are open to engaging with each other. And so there's an opening, there's a lack of political movement. There's an opening for working on the ground. There's resources, unprecedented resources to do that. And so that's why I look at it as a potential moment where we could be turning things around. It is not a short-term fix, and we have never sold a short-term fix, which sometimes makes it harder to break through in the political discussions or break through the media, because they're just looking at what's going on right now and tomorrow. We're talking about doing the work of a generation, because we're several generations into this conflict and we keep passing it on to the next one. And so when we see a moment where we might actually be switching to a different track, then we have some hope for what could be 20 years from now if we actually follow through.
Yeah, there's definitely such positive work going on, but it does, I mean, we all know, look at our own lives. What does it take for us to change little things in our life, let alone a whole, country, try to bring them together? It's difficult to say the least, but it's been done before. So, there is hope, and you see changes on the ground happening as you say. But when violent acts occur, they're horrible in of themselves, but can you talk about their impact on both sides as a representation of the peoples and the proliferation of negative stereotypes?
It's probably one of the worst dynamics that has driven and fueled this conflict over all of these years, because most Israelis and Palestinians are not fighting hand-to-hand combat against each other. It's something they experience by talking to people, hearing people, seeing things on the news. Palestinians do have more contact, especially in the West Bank, with the difficult situation of the occupation, because their lives are arranged around it, and in some cases it's an extremely challenging situation. But so much of what people think about the other side comes from not even the personal interaction, but the perception. Mm-hmm. And when violence occurs, it sends everyone back into their corners, and it makes them think the worst of the other. and it makes them look at the TV. We all know who gets on TV. The people that get on TV are the craziest and the loudest and the most violent. I mean, this is true of media everywhere in this day and age, for sure. And it's the same here. And so what you as an Israeli see of the Palestinians is not the millions of people that go about their lives and kiss their kids to send them off to school in the morning and, you know, struggle to put two ends together in a difficult environment so that you can raise your kids and build onto your house and so forth. What they see are the terrorists in you know, ski masks who are building terror tunnels and launching rockets and all these kind of things.
Yeah.
And what Palestinians see of Israelis, if it's not from personal experience in the West Bank or inside Israel, it's also from the media, and it's the settlers, and it's the super right wing, and it's and there's racism and there's violence. And again, it's not about what millions of people are like in their normal daily lives and the values that these people share, most of them. It's about the few that you see who are visible. And so when we watch the opinion polls over the decades, it is often the case that the support for peace and the feeling of trust in the other goes up and down along with the violence. It's not a magic formula. It's quite simple. And if you are an extremist who is politically opposed to a peaceful outcome, because a peaceful outcome means essentially sharing in one way or another, rather than having it all, then violence is a very effective way to destroy the prospects of that. Because with just a few acts of violence, you can completely tank the goodwill and the faith and the trust that the other side has in you.
But also, I'm thinking of next week's, I'm interviewing one of the founders of Roots, Pastor John Moyle, and he's a co-founder of it, and so is Hanan Schlesinger, Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, and I'm going to be playing a clip of, he's talking about when the first time he met Palestinians, and he's a very religious rabbi living in the West Bank. He's a settler, and Pastor John had set up a meeting with him and Palestinians for the first time who also live in the West Bank, and their interchanges is, the Palestinian person that he's meeting and he's talking to is telling Rabbi Hanan how, his kids cry when they see an Israeli soldier or a settler, and Hanan's mystified, in his mind, he's scared of Palestinians, he's and the interchange is incredible, but the fear and what we hear of each other and what we know of each other and our perceptions, and it's confusing, and it just needs to be, the more people meet each other and talk to each other and realize we're all humans and we want the same things, it's so important. And it's such an incredible thing that all of these AllMEP organizations working together with each other, it's so essential.
If you zoom out, what all of these organizations are doing, each in its own sphere, but building up into a huge collective impact, is we're reshuffling the players and the teams. Mm-hmm. We're changing who's the us and who's the them. Correct. Because right now, most people by default, and because of fear and because of history and because of all these things, they approach the conflict with an us versus them attitude, and the us is my national group and the them is the other side. But the truth is that line does not accurately reflect what those people really want out of life and their values in the world. If you instead resorted people by where they want to be, what kind of world, what kind of country they want to live in, then you would find large majorities of us who believe in democracy and civil rights and living in the land of your ancestors and respecting each other's faiths and having a vibrant multicultural society on one side. And on the other side, you'd have quite a few, but still minorities of extremists who have no compromise that they would accept. And the only end game that they have is to, quote, win. When we know from history that there's no winner takes all situation here. Nobody's going to win. They're just going to fight to a bloody draw until they realize there's a different path. And so we're reshuffling the teams and changing where the dividing line is. So we get the majorities who want good stuff on one side, so they can actually achieve their dreams.
Well, one thing that I'd really like to talk about, because I think it's such an amazing story, is how you put together AllMEP. When you were first developing it, you got together just a few grassroots organizations who you felt were operating in their own lonely silo, taking on the weight of working on peace on their own. And can you tell us about the beginnings? Because it really is. I mean, I feel like the story behind AllMEP should have, some kind of patriotic, song behind it or something. I have visions of Martin Luther King, and it's what you've done is amazing. So can you talk about how you got together all these groups and in your law firm and how it all worked?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to me, 18 years later to think back on it. And it's been a roller coaster. It's not a linear, a straight line from where we started to where we are now. But and sometimes actually I am amazed that anyone gave me the time of day, because I was I think about 26 years old. I was a very young lawyer at a big law firm. And as I mentioned earlier, the violence I was seeing on TV sort of sucked me back into the conflict. And I really wanted to find a way that I could do something from where I was in Washington. And I like to tell this story, to lawyers, especially young lawyers, as an example of some of the cool things they can do as pro bono projects. And B, to tell people who are living in the diaspora that there are ways that we can engage. There are people we can support that are part of solutions. And so I was in this law firm and I reached out to these three organizations I mentioned and just said to them, hey, I'm in this fancy law firm. I don't know what I can do for you, but maybe we can help from here. My law firm did a lot of public policy work and lobbying in Washington. And when they came back and said that they need more visibility and they need more awareness and they need important people to know what they do, it seemed natural that we should bring them to Washington. And so we organized a conference a few months later in early 2004. We got a room on Capitol Hill and we ended up having a full house. There were probably 300 people that showed up. We reached out to some Arab and Jewish organizations in Washington to speak for a few minutes, just to give some credibility to what this young guy was doing. And we had a dozen organizations. It was the most we could find because they were so disconnected. They came to Washington. They told their stories over lunch. We had it catered by an Israeli and Palestinian restaurants. And what came out of that meeting, it almost made itself, because the organizations walked out of the meeting and said, wow, when we come here, we feel so much strength. Usually we feel like we're spitting into the wind, like we're pushing uphill. And when we come together, we feel so much strength in numbers and knowing that we have these amazing colleagues. And when we come to speak and tell our stories to people in Washington who are important, we feel that they're behind us. We feel the strength of that experience. And the policymakers also left the room with a bit of amazement because, in Washington, they make it their business to feel like they're keeping on top of what's going on around the world. There are people there following this conflict closely, and they had no idea that under the radar, there was this entire layer of work and activity taking place. And so at the time, I had brought in a bunch of lawyers in my firm. I got the firm to make it an official pro bono project. So I don't know. I haven't told this very often, but the firm paid for the lunch, for example. They gave me $1,000 or something to pay for the lunch.
Mazel tov.
Yeah. And anyone who doesn't believe that corporate America does good things from time to time needs to know that there are things like this happening.
So corporate America was listening.
Yeah. Maybe you'll get some sponsors for your program.
Well, wouldn't that be nice?
I had basically walked up and down the hallways of the law firm trying to find people who would help me, and had a couple dozen people, lawyers, that were volunteering their time. And we basically started a process where we, first of all, did some research about, what kind of money has the United States given in the past, and what kind of money have they given elsewhere, which is where we learned about the Ireland Fund, for example. And what kinds of things can we push for in the future? And also, how can we organize these organizations so that they can, make this not just a one-off meeting, but actually have a sustained effort to raise their visibility and build deeper connections between each other and speak to policymakers and advocate for resources and so on. So what came out of that was a proposal to the organizations to do a few things. One, create a coalition, which is what AllMEP became. And we negotiated for a year. We had a conference call every 2 weeks. People on the line from Washington and Israel and Palestine and all over the world, California, negotiating, what does this coalition look like? And what is our name going to be? And what are our principles? And what does it take to join? And what do we stand for? And who's our leadership and all that stuff? So coalition was number one. Number two was we identified some money that was brand new. Just that year, by coincidence, Congress had created a reconciliation programs fund to support activities that bring people together across conflict lines. And so we found that and we said, this is amazing. Let's try to support it. Let's try to make it successful. Let's try to get it bigger. And so we began working on that right away, which was great because other than the few politicians who had been involved in creating it, it had no supporters. It was brand new. There was nobody out there who was championing this money or bringing the knowledge from the field to the policymakers to inform how it would work.
That was the Conflict Management and Mitigation Fund?
Yeah, that fund went on to operate for ever since, to be honest. It was run by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and has invested some $130 million just in Israeli-Palestinian programs because of the work that we've done. And it actually operates around the world too. They've invested another $130 some million in other conflict zones. So that's something that we're very proud of, that we've been the lead champions for all of these years. And then the third thing that I suggested to the organizations was $10 million a year is great. But if we compare that investment, even at that level, to the needs and the force of the conflict itself, we're going to need a lot more. And so we looked at the Ireland example and we put together a proposal to create an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace. One of the funny footnotes is back in 2004, I couldn't even convince the NGOs that we should go for it. We did the coalition, we did the annual $10 million fund, but I couldn't sell them on the international fund. But a few years later, we came back to it and we launched a campaign. And here we are today.
Yeah, 250 million. What a great start, huh?
It was like a pinch myself moment when we watched that happen. Also because there were so many ups and downs over those years. People that were our supporters on Capitol Hill that became more important in their jobs and that would help us. People that were our supporters that lost elections and then we need to find new supporters. People, the interest groups that we partnered with who are engaged in this conflict. Ultimately, we built probably the broadest coalition that has ever existed around Israeli-Palestinian issues. That wasn't easy. There were many days where that was difficult.
It passed at the end of 2020 and it was bipartisan.
And it was
how could that be? You know, it had to be a miracle.
The fact that you could have a bipartisan bill pass in 2020 while the world was in flames and American democracy was all upended, around not a simple issue, right? Like not naming a post office, but trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It completely boggles the mind. And I really think it's just a testament to how you never know when the moment will be that, you know, showing up every day, you actually make some progress in the direction you're trying to head.
Yeah. You know, that all has been just such a wonderful, positive step forward. I kind of want to end on the fact that you did have that happen and we're moving forward. So let me ask you a final question. If you could talk to the world, what would you want them to know about AllMEP?
I'd want them to know that there's a way to solve this conflict. And it's not about just politicians, and it's not just about what the terms of the peace deal are. It's about making sure that we're building a solid foundation from the ground up. And we know how to do it. The pilot programs, the innovation has been going on for 20 and 30 years. We know how to do it on a small scale. The question is, can we operate at a level that can stand up to the conflict itself? The status quo is the least. When you ask people among Palestinians and Israelis, what options would you like to resolve the conflict? Of all the options out on the table, the status quo is the least popular. So the thing that people are stuck with is the one they least prefer. Our mission, our challenge is to engage them, empower them so that they can change that, so that they don't have to live in their least preferred world. And we know how to do it. It's just a matter of resources and focus. And as I said before, the struggle of a generation. You can't do this for one day or 1 month or 1 year and hope that you're going to tackle what is a deeply rooted conflict. You have to commit for the long term. And so we bring to the table the know-how, the programs, the alumni, the people that have been involved, the opportunities, and we're trying to bring to the table the entire world in terms of support and resources, now with an immense step forward from the United States with $250 million. I don't think we have any idea yet just how much difference that's going to make. And you would be amazed at what a buzz it's created here. People you wouldn't imagine who are talking about the possibilities. So it's really, in that sense, very exciting.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Avi, for your time today and for all your hard work over all these years. It's really paying off. And for sharing the work at AllMEP. And next week, November 23rd at 11 a.m. Pacific time, Peace with Penny will be interviewing Pastor John Moyle. He's another terrific human being that helped found one of my favorite peace organizations, Ruth Shorashim Juder. He's a Christian pastor, and he helped bring together Roots, this Israeli Palestinian peace organization that concentrates on bringing peace in the West Bank that I mentioned during the program. I'm sure you'll find our conversation inspiring. And for now, thanks for listening, and may you live in peace, shalom, and salam.